She was the invisible engine running a multi-million-dollar empire discarded because her cruel boss decided her plus-size body didn't fit his aesthetic. He thought firing her was a power move. He didn't know he just handed the city's most ruthless mafia boss the ultimate weapon. If you looked at the organizational chart of Covington Global Logistics, Penelope Higgins was listed as an executive assistant. If you looked at the reality of the Chicago-based firm, Penelope was the spine, the brain, and the beating heart of the entire operation. Penelope was 28 years old, possessing a brilliant logistical mind, an unparalleled work ethic, and a size 22 body. She was unapologetically fat, a fact she had long ago made peace with, even if the corporate world had not. She was warm, sharply intelligent, and had a memory like a steel trap. For 3 years, she had orchestrated complex international freight routes, managed temperamental union bosses, and kept the company from going under. Her boss, Richard Covington, was the heir to the company, a man born on third base who thought he had hit a triple. Richard was 34, impeccably groomed, fiercely narcissistic, and deeply, viciously fatphobic. He treated Penelope not as a crucial asset, but as an embarrassment he was forced to endure because she was the only one who could fix his constant mistakes. The abuse was rarely physical, but it was relentless. Richard would schedule walking meetings, knowing Penelope's knees ached in the winter, deliberately walking at a blistering pace. He would leave passive-aggressive pamphlets for weight loss retreats on her desk. He would refer to her as the heavy machinery when she was out of earshot and sometimes when she wasn't. Penelope, order the salads for the board meeting today. Richard sneered one brisk October morning, leaning against the doorframe of her cubicle. And maybe just have a water yourself. The chairs in the conference room are vintage Herman Miller. I'd rather they not give out under pressure. Penelope swallowed the hot spike of humiliation, her fingers freezing over her keyboard. I'll arrange the catering, Mr. Covington, but I need you to sign off on the Port of Miami reroute before noon, or we lose the shipping window. Just stamp my signature on it. You know I don't read that tedious garbage. He waved her off, adjusting his Tom Ford tie. That tedious garbage was a highly sensitive logistical reroute that saved the company $4 million in tariffs. Penelope stamped it. She saved the company. And a week later, Richard took all the credit during a high-stakes dinner with their newest and most intimidating prospective client, Bianchi Industries. Bianchi Industries was supposedly a massive import-export conglomerate. On paper, they moved olive oil textiles and European automotive parts. In reality, the streets of Chicago whispered that the CEO, Lorenzo Bianchi, was the head of the most powerful modern syndicate in the Midwest. Lorenzo needed a new logistics partner to move his freight quietly and efficiently, and Covington Global was in the running. The preliminary meetings had gone surprisingly well, mostly because Penelope had secretly drafted every single proposal, anticipating the syndicate's need for untraceable shadow routes. But as the final contract signing approached, Richard's vanity reached a fever pitch. He wanted the office to look like a spread in GQ magazine. He hired a new receptionist, a size 2 former model named Sarah Jenkins, who couldn't use Excel, but looked fantastic in a pencil skirt. The day before, Lorenzo Bianchi was scheduled to visit the headquarters to sign the exclusive contract. Richard called Penelope into the center of the open-plan bullpen. He didn't even have the decency to do it behind closed doors. "Penelope, we need to talk about your future here," Richard announced, his voice carrying over the typing of 50 employees. Penelope stood up, smoothing down her sensible black slacks. "Is this about the Bianchi manifest? Richard, I've already triple-checked the customs declarations." "No, Penelope. It's about our brand," Richard interrupted, smiling a chilling plastic smile. Covington Global is entering a new tier of luxury corporate partnerships. We are projecting speed, efficiency, and sleekness." He looked her up and down with blatant, undisguised disgust. "You don't fit that profile. You take up too much space in this office, literally and figuratively. It's bad for our image." The bullpen went dead silent. Penelope felt the blood drain from her face. You're firing me because of my weight. I'm terminating your employment due to a restructuring of the executive suite," Richard corrected smoothly, legally covering his tracks. "Sarah will be taking over my direct assistance. Security has a box for your personal items. I want you out of the building in 10 minutes. "Sarah doesn't know the first thing about the shadow routes," Penelope said, her voice shaking with a mix of fury and devastation. "She doesn't know the union passwords. She doesn't know the customs loopholes I built for the Bianchi deal. It's shipping, Penelope. It's not rocket science." Richard laughed, turning his back on her. "We'll manage without the dead weight." Humiliated, with dozens of pitying eyes boring into her back, Penelope packed her desk. She didn't cry. She held her head high, picked up her heavy cardboard box, and walked out of Covington Global Logistics. She left behind a company that had just decapitated its own brain. A week passed. For Penelope, it was a blur of daytime television, sending out resumes to companies that never called back and crying into her pillow. The reality of being unemployed in downtown Chicago was terrifying. Her savings were meager. Richard had always vastly underpaid her. She felt entirely worthless, replaying Richard's cruel words about her body taking up too much space on an endless, torturous loop. Meanwhile, at Covington Global, the sky was falling. Without Penelope, the intricate logistical web she had spun immediately tangled. Shipments were delayed. Customs flagged 3 different containers because Sarah Jenkins used the wrong tariff codes. But the most fatal error occurred during the final contract signing with Lorenzo Bianchi. Lorenzo Bianchi was not a man who tolerated incompetence. At 36, he was a lethal combination of old-world ruthlessness and modern corporate savvy. He was strikingly handsome, but his dark, calculating eyes held a cold fire that made grown men sweat. Sitting in Richard's glass-walled conference room, Lorenzo looked over the final operational schedules Richard had presented. Lorenzo tapped a heavy gold pen against the mahogany table. "Mr. Covington." Lorenzo's voice was a low, terrifying baritone. "This schedule has my shipments bottlenecking in Newark. The draft I saw last month bypassed Newark entirely using a blind company transfer in Delaware." "Where is the Delaware route?" Richard panicked, sweating through his custom suit. He looked at Sarah, who was busy filing her nails in the corner. We optimized the route, Mr. Bianchi, to save on fuel." Lorenzo didn't blink. "The Delaware route saved me from federal oversight. Newark puts my cargo directly in the hands of the Port Authority. You didn't optimize anything. You lost the route." Lorenzo leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Who wrote the initial proposal?" "I did, of course." Richard lied, his voice cracking. Lorenzo stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "No, you didn't. The mind that built that proposal was sharp, detail-oriented, and understood exactly what I needed without me having to say it." "You are a fool in a cheap suit." Lorenzo signaled to his 2 massive bodyguards. "Find out who actually ran this company. We are done here." It took Lorenzo's men exactly 24 hours to find Penelope. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Penelope was sitting in a booth at an old diner on the outskirts of the West Loop, nursing a lukewarm coffee and aggressively circling job ads in a discarded newspaper. She wore a comfortable, oversized sweater, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, looking completely defeated. The bell above the diner door jingled. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted, growing heavy and tense. Penelope looked up to see 3 men in impeccably tailored dark suits approach her booth. The 2 massive men stood back, scanning the diner, while the man in the center slid effortlessly into the booth opposite her. Penelope recognized him instantly from the dossiers she had compiled. Lorenzo Bianchi, the head of the Chicago syndicate. Her breath hitched, panic rising in her chest. Had Richard blamed the botched routes on her? Was the Mafia here to tie up loose ends? Penelope Higgins. Lorenzo said, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. It wasn't a question. Mr. Bianchi, Penelope managed to say, forcing her voice to remain steady. If Richard sent you, I have nothing to do with Covington Global anymore. I don't have access to your shipping manifests. Richard Covington is a dead man, walking financially speaking, Lorenzo replied, waving a hand dismissively. He signaled the waitress for a coffee, his eyes never leaving Penelope's face. He looked at her intently, taking in her soft, full features, the sharp intelligence in her wide eyes, and the undeniable presence she held even in an oversized sweater in a greasy diner. My men did some digging, Lorenzo continued. They found out that the Delaware shadow route, the Miami tariff loophole, and the Union pacification strategies were all designed by an executive assistant making $60,000 a year. I was very good at my job, Penelope said, quietly, looking down at her hands. You were the only good thing about that company, Lorenzo corrected. Why were you fired? Penelope flushed, the familiar shame burning her cheeks. She didn't want to explain to a terrifying, gorgeous Mafia boss that she was fired for being too fat. Corporate restructuring. Mr. Covington felt my image didn't align with the luxury brand. Lorenzo's eyes darkened, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features. He was a predator, and he understood the dynamics of power. He knew exactly what she meant. He looked at her body not with disgust, but with a slow, appreciative calculation. Covington is a weak man who fears what he cannot control, Lorenzo said softly. He looked at you and saw a woman who was smarter than him, stronger than him, and who took up the space she rightfully deserved. So he tried to shrink you. Penelope stared at him, stunned. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever seen her so clearly. I don't need a luxury image, Penelope. I need a general. Lorenzo leaned across the table, the scent of expensive cologne and rain enveloping her. My organization is vast. The legitimate fronts are expanding, and my current logistics director is an idiot who is skimming off the top. I need someone with a mind like yours. You want me to work for the Mafia? Penelope whispered, glancing nervously around the diner. I want you to be my director of operations, my second in command for all legitimate and transitional enterprises, Lorenzo stated, laying a sleek black envelope on the table. You will have a corner office, a salary 5 times what Covington paid you, and complete autonomy over the supply chain. You report only to me. Penelope stared at the envelope. Why me? You could hire anyone. I'm just a fired assistant. Look at me. I am looking at you, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping an octave heavy with a strange dark warmth. I see a woman who held an empire together with bare hands. I see a woman who has been starved of the respect she is owed. Work for me, Penelope, and I promise you, no one in this city will ever make you feel small again. Penelope looked from the envelope to Lorenzo's intense, unwavering gaze. For the first time in her life, she felt dangerous. She felt powerful. She reached out and placed her hand over the envelope. When do I start? She asked. A slow, predatory smile spread across Lorenzo's face. Right now, we have an empire to run, and a man named Richard Covington to destroy. Penelope Higgins did not merely step into her new role at Bianchi Industries. She claimed it like a conqueror entering a surrendered city, Her new office was a sprawling penthouse suite on the 42nd floor of the Bianchi Tower in downtown Chicago, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The day she arrived, Lorenzo had a tailor waiting for her. "Off the rack is for subordinates," Lorenzo had told her, his dark eyes tracing the curve of her hips. "You are my second in command. You will dress like the royalty you are." Within weeks, Penelope's wardrobe was a masterclass in executive power. She wore custom-tailored Marina Rinaldi power suits in deep burgundies, emerald greens, and midnight blues that draped perfectly over her size 22 figure. She stopped hiding behind oversized sweaters and started wearing structured blazers with sharp shoulders and silk blouses. For the first time in her life, she took up space unapologetically. But her transformation was not just physical, it was operational. Penelope dove into the syndicate's books with a surgical precision that terrified the old guard. Her first target was Arthur Pendleton, the syndicate's current corrupt logistics director. Arthur was a greasy, silver-haired man who had been skimming off Lorenzo's legitimate construction fronts for years. He took one look at Penelope, a soft, plus-size woman holding a tablet, and smirked, assuming she was just Lorenzo's new plaything. He found out how wrong he was during her first executive board meeting. The room was filled with 20 of Chicago's most dangerous men capos and lieutenants who managed the lifeblood of the Bianchi empire. Lorenzo sat at the head of the long mahogany table, silent and imposing, gesturing for Penelope to take the floor. "Gentlemen," Penelope began, her voice steady, projecting effortlessly across the room. She tapped a button, and the massive screen behind her illuminated with a complex web of shipping manifests, offshore accounts, and trucking routes. "Over the past 72 hours, I have audited our interstate freight operations, and I have found a $3 million hemorrhage." Arthur Pendleton scoffed loudly. "Listen, sweetheart. You might know how to fetch coffee for a corporate suit, but this is the real world. Our roots are ironclad. The overhead is just the cost of doing business in the Midwest." Penelope turned to Arthur, her expression ice cold. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. "The cost of doing business, Arthur, does not include routing our Southside construction materials through a dummy corporation in the Cayman Islands that is registered in your wife's maiden name," Penelope stated clearly. The room went dead silent. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Penelope pressed another button. A bank statement flashed on the screen. "You've been overcharging the syndicate for diesel fuel by 20% and pocketing the difference through a shell company. You also botched the Detroit reroute last month, blaming customs when, in reality, you sold our warehouse space to the O'Sullivan family for a quick under-the-table payout." Arthur turned, completely pale, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. He looked toward Lorenzo, his voice trembling. "Boss Lorenzo, I swear this bitch is making it up. She's manipulating the data." Lorenzo didn't raise his voice. He didn't even move. He simply leaned back in his leather chair and looked at Arthur, with eyes that promised violence. "You will address her as Ms. Higgins, and Ms. Higgins does not make mistakes." "Pack your desk, Arthur," Penelope commanded, her tone final. "You have exactly 10 minutes to leave the building before I hand these ledgers over to the feds, or worse, let Mr. Bianchi handle your severance package." Arthur practically sprinted out of the room. The remaining capos stared at Penelope, their initial skepticism replaced by profound, fearful respect. She had just dismantled a 30-year veteran of the syndicate in under 3 minutes, using nothing but a spreadsheet. Lorenzo looked at Penelope from across the room, a slow, dark smile curving his lips. The raw, predatory hunger in his eyes made Penelope's breath catch in her throat. He wasn't just impressed. He was utterly captivated by her brilliance. Under Penelope's control, the Bianchi syndicate's profits skyrocketed. She implemented decentralized shipping networks, digitized their offshore banking, and created a supply chain so tightly optimized that not a single truck boat or cargo plane was ever flagged by federal authorities. She was brilliant, and with Lorenzo's terrifying reputation backing her, she was untouchable. Meanwhile, a few miles away, Covington Global Logistics was burning to the ground. Without Penelope's constant vigilance, Richard Covington had driven his family's company into a spectacular nosedive. Sarah Jenkins had quit after 2 weeks when she realized she couldn't charm her way out of federal customs audits. Clients were leaving in droves. Desperate to save face and keep his luxury lifestyle afloat, Richard made the most fatal mistake of his pampered life. He needed cash quickly to pay off crippling debts he had hidden from his board of directors. He reached out to Declan O'Sullivan, the brutal head of the Irish syndicate, and Lorenzo Bianchi's fiercest rival. Richard promised Declan exclusive use of the Covington shipping lanes for a massive shipment of illegal firearms coming in from Eastern Europe, taking a massive $2 million advance to keep his company solvent. What Richard didn't know was that he didn't own those shipping lanes anymore. Penelope had systematically engineered a quiet, hostile buyout of Covington Global's most crucial port contracts through a series of Bianchi-owned shell companies. When Declan O'Sullivan's shipment arrived at the port of Chicago, the dock workers who now reported strictly to Penelope's union bosses refused to unload the cargo. The feds seized the containers within hours. Declan O'Sullivan was out $20 million in contraband, and he wanted Richard Covington's head on a spike. It was a cold, rainy Thursday evening when Richard Covington received the phone call. His accounts were frozen. The bank was foreclosing on his Gold Coast penthouse, and Declan O'Sullivan's men had been seen circling the Covington Global parking garage. Terrified, weeping, and entirely out of options, Richard called the only man in Chicago powerful enough to protect him from the Irish syndicate, Lorenzo Bianchi. He begged for a meeting, offering to sell Covington Global for pennies on the dollar, in exchange for Lorenzo paying off his debt to Declan and letting him live. Lorenzo agreed. He told Richard to come to the penthouse boardroom of the Bianchi Tower at midnight. When Richard stepped off the private elevator onto the 42nd floor, he looked like a ghost of his former self. His expensive Tom Ford suit hung loosely on his frame. He hadn't slept in days, and he was trembling so hard he could barely hold his leather briefcase. 2 massive armed men escorted him down the marble hallway and pushed open the heavy oak doors to the boardroom. The room was dimly lit, the city lights of Chicago sparkling through the rain-streaked glass behind the massive executive desk. A high-backed leather chair faced the window, obscuring the person sitting in it. "Mr. Bianchi." Richard stammered, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. He wrung his hands together. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing me. I know our previous deal didn't work out, but I am prepared to sign over Covington Global tonight. Complete controlling interest. I need you to call off Declan O'Sullivan." The leather chair slowly swiveled around. Richard's jaw dropped. The briefcase slipped from his trembling, sweaty hands, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Sitting behind the desk wearing a stunning, custom-tailored crimson blazer was Penelope Higgins. She looked immaculate, powerful, lethal. "Hello, Richard," Penelope said smoothly, her voice a velvety purr that held no trace of the nervous assistant she used to be. "Penelope," Richard gasped, rubbing his eyes as if he were hallucinating. What are you doing here? Where is Lorenzo? You can't be here, you're... I'm what, Richard?" Penelope leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany desk, her manicured fingers steepled together. "Too big for this chair. Taking up too much space for your aesthetic." "I don't understand." Richard panicked, looking frantically at the 2 armed guards at the door who stood motionless. "Are you his secretary, Penelope? Please tell him I'm here. Declan is going to kill me." A deep, dark chuckle echoed from the shadows corner of the room. Lorenzo Bianchi stepped into the light, holding a glass of amber whiskey. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator. He walked over to the desk and stood directly behind Penelope, placing a large, possessive hand on her shoulder. "She is not my secretary, Covington." Lorenzo said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the room. "She is the director of operations for the entire Bianchi syndicate. She is my second in command, and she is the woman who owns your company." Richard's knees buckled, and he collapsed heavily into a guest chair. "Owns it, no." "No, that's impossible. I own Covington Global." "You own a hollow shell." "Richard," Penelope corrected, sliding a thick black folder across the desk. "Over the last 2 months, I have systematically bought out every single one of your port contracts, union agreements, and shipping manifests using our subsidiary fronts. The routes you tried to sell to Declan O'Sullivan, they belonged to me. You sold him air. And when his cargo got seized, it was because my dock workers flagged it." Richard stared at her, sheer horror radiating from his eyes. You did this. You destroyed me." "I didn't destroy you, Richard. Your own incompetence did. I simply stopped holding you up," Penelope said, her voice devoid of pity. "You fired me because my body offended your delicate sensibilities. You thought I was worthless because I didn't fit into a size 2 pencil skirt. But you forgot one crucial detail." Penelope stood up. She towered over Richard, her presence magnificent and overwhelming. "My brain is what made you rich. And without me, you are nothing but a spoiled boy in a cheap suit." Lorenzo looked at Penelope, his eyes blazing with open adoration and deep, consuming desire. He had never seen anything more beautiful than this woman claiming her absolute power. "Now," Penelope said, tapping the black folder. "Inside this folder is a contract. You will sign over the remaining brand assets and intellectual property of Covington Global to Bianchi Industries for exactly $1. In exchange, mister, Bianchi will pay off your $2 million debt to Declan O'Sullivan, saving your life." $1, Richard whispered, tears finally spilling over his cheeks. "It's my family's legacy." "Your legacy is bankrupt," Lorenzo snapped, stepping forward. "Sign the paper, Covington, or I will let Declan's men scrape you off the pavement." Trembling violently, Richard pulled a pen from his pocket. With a shaking hand, he signed his name on the dotted line, officially handing over his entire empire to the woman he had discarded like trash. "Get out," Penelope commanded softly. "And if you ever show your face in the logistics district of this city again, it won't be Declan you have to worry about." The guards hauled the weeping Richard to his feet and dragged him out of the boardroom. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. The room fell into a heavy, charged silence. The rain continued to batter the floor-to-ceiling windows. Penelope let out a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline was slowly leaving her system, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The ghost of Richard Covington, the voice in her head that told her she was ugly and worthless, was finally dead and buried. She turned to look at Lorenzo. He set his whiskey glass down on the desk and closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. "You were magnificent," Lorenzo murmured, his voice thick with raw emotion. He reached out his large hands, gently cupping her face. His thumbs brushed softly across her cheekbones. A terrifying, beautiful queen. Penelope leaned into his touch, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I couldn't have done it without you giving me the platform." "I gave you nothing but a desk, Penelope. You built the throne yourself," Lorenzo whispered fiercely. He looked down at her lips, the tension between them that had been building for months, finally snapping. "You take up exactly the right amount of space. In this company, and in my life." When he kissed her, it wasn't tentative. It was acclaiming. It was deep bruising and filled with a passionate reverence that made Penelope's toes curl. She wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, pulling him closer, letting herself fully surrender to the heat and power of the man who saw her exactly as she was and worshipped her for it. 6 months later, high society in Chicago experienced a seismic shift. The annual charity gala for urban development was held at the lavish ballroom of the Drake Hotel. It was the most exclusive event of the season, crawling with politicians, old money socialites, and corporate titans. When the double doors to the grand ballroom opened, the room fell into a hushed silence. Lorenzo Bianchi walked in, looking like a dark god in a custom tuxedo, but all eyes were on the woman on his arm. Penelope wore a breathtaking, custom-designed gown of deep emerald velvet that hugged her lush curves and spilled down to the marble floor in a dramatic train. Diamonds dripped from her ears and rested against her collarbone. She held her head high, a confident, dazzling smile on her face. She saw a few of her old colleagues from Covington Global in the crowd. They stared at her, their jaws slack with shock, recognizing the woman they used to mock, now standing at the absolute pinnacle of Chicago's elite. Lorenzo leaned down his lips, brushing against her ear. "They are staring at you." "Let them," Penelope whispered back, her eyes sparkling with wicked triumph. "I want them to see exactly what they lost." Lorenzo chuckled a low, rumbling sound that belonged entirely to her. He kissed her temple, pulling her flush against his side. "They lost a secretary, but I gained an empire and a queen to rule it with." Together they walked into the center of the ballroom, taking up all the space they deserved, unstoppable and magnificent. Are you obsessed with Penelope's epic revenge and her dark, powerful romance with Lorenzo? If this plus-size Mafia romance gave you all the chills and thrills, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that like button, share this video with your friends who love a badass heroine, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible jaw-dropping stories. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a dramatic twist. See you in the next story.